At this hour, nearly 2 weeks after the Egypt-brokered truce between Israel and Palestine was put in place, tensions are simmering in the contested neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem yet again. Two prominent activists, a brother-sister duo, was arrested by the Israeli police. They were released after long hours of detention. Siblings Muna and Muhammad Al-Kurd are prominent activists from Sheikh Jarrah, an area which has now become a flashpoint for protests in recent weeks. They are leading campaigners advocating the rights of Palestinians with thousands of followers. The pair has now been at the forefront of a social media movement against forced expulsions of Palestinians in the occupied East Jerusalem. 23-year-old Muna Al-Kurd was taken into custody from her home. The police stormed the house and forced the twins out in a barbaric manner. And footage on your screens shows the 23-year-old Muna handcuffed and being escorted from her home by Israeli officers. On charges of inciting riots, the police later sent out summons for the brother, Muhammad. He then had to turn himself in and claimed of being held for long hours as well. Both have been released now and have returned home. According to their lawyer, both the young activists have been warned to stop carrying on with their activities.
Today, the Israeli occupation forces arrested me and my sister from Sheikh Jarrah in a clear intimidation move to stop us from speaking out against the injustices that they commit, the injustices the settlers commit. We were detained for hours, and clearly they had no basis on which to charge us, and so we were released afterwards.
But before Al-Kurd was freed, the police briefly clashed with a crowd outside the police station. Protesters called for the release of the activists, and the police were seen throwing stun grenades and firing rubber bullets. The Palestinian Red Crescent Society said that 10 people were injured. The detentions come a day after the police in Sheikh Jarrah arrested a reporter covering the demonstrations with the media network of Al Jazeera. A fear of the outbreak of possible violence has prompted the senior police commanders to reportedly reroute a planned Jewish right-wing march. The march was expected to pass through the old city's Damascus Gate. The government has also agreed to reroute the march. The flag march takes place every year on Jerusalem Day, and the route taken by people is long deemed provocative. The renewed violence has now also posed a problem for the fragile coalition formed by embattled Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's opponents. For more updates, we are now being joined by Jody Cohen, an international affairs expert from Jerusalem. Jody, thanks so much for joining us. You have, of course, been tracking the conflict for weeks from Jerusalem and getting us all the live updates. What can you tell us about the arrest of these two Palestinian activists?
Hi, Priyanka. Yes, so we know that these activists, these siblings, have been arrested and now they've been released. Israel says that they arrested them because they participated in violent riots. We also know that an Al Jazeera reporter was arrested, and Israel says that's for assaulting a police officer. We have got this temporary ceasefire with Hamas now, between Hamas and Israel. That has been agreed indirectly, and there are still negotiations going on right now between Egypt and Hamas and Egypt and Israel, and it is very fragile, and there are still ongoing tensions. You know, as we talked about, there's the ongoing legal battle in Sheikh Jarrah, which is, on the one hand, the Palestinians are saying that families are going to be evicted unfairly, unlawfully, and on the other hand, the Israeli legal system, which is still ongoing, it hasn't finally resolved yet, is saying that these buildings are owned by a Jewish organization, and as in any housing arrangement, they have the right to decide who should live there, and actually that they offered the Palestinian families to continue living in those homes, paying rent. We also have the Jerusalem Day parade, which was rerouted originally and then was postponed because of the rockets and missiles that came from Hamas into Jerusalem on that day. Now, that's an annual parade. Israel would argue it's an expression of Jewish unity and of Israeli unity and pride in having a unified Jerusalem. The Palestinians argue that it is provocative. But Israel also says that the unrest now isn't actually to do with the legal battles in Sheikh Jarrah and the potential Jerusalem Day parade that might be rescheduled. Israel argues that this is really about the Palestinian elections and the fact that they got cancelled and haven't taken place in years. And they argue that it's actually an internal battle between Fatah and Hamas over who are the true representatives of the Palestinian people.
Right, Jody, just wrapping up our discussion here, there was some sort of calm in the region after days of fighting and loss of lives on both sides, of course. Will these arrests lead up to a flare-up between the two sides, and what will then happen to the ceasefire?
I wouldn't have thought that the arrests would lead to a flare-up of the ceasefire. It really depends on Hamas and their strategic decisions. Certainly, this could have implications for the results of the Israeli election. As you know, the coalition government negotiations were happening, and then the Gaza missiles started firing from Hamas into Israeli population centers, and that stalled the coalition negotiations. So it could be that Hamas take the strategic decision to use these protests and these arrests as an opportunity to start fire again. Perhaps they want to pause on the ceasefire in order to stop this change bloc government, which Hamas would argue they don't want to see normalization. They were against the normalization between Israel and the Arab countries, as we've seen over the last year, and they certainly wouldn't want to see Arab participation in any change bloc government. If it happens, we'll know over the next week or so, this would be the most diverse government in Israeli history.
Right, Jody, thank you so much for all those inputs, and thank you for joining us on WION.